My name is Christine Y. Kim. I'm Associate Curator of Contemporary Art at LACMA, and I'm the co-founder of the Los Angeles Nomadic Division, or LAND. Prior to being in Los Angeles, I was in New York, where I was Associate Curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem for 8 years. And they've asked me to speak on this panel today, actually to select a couple of artists and to speak today about my most recent collaboration, which is up right now at Collins Park, called Art Public, one of the sectors of Art Basel Miami Beach 2011. It's the first time that Art Basel has done a collaboration with the Basel Museum of this scale, whereby they've asked me to curate a selection of artwork to be situated on site in front of the Basel Museum of Collins Park, clear to oceanfront, to the beach. And when I came out for my initial site visit, the first thing that struck me, I've been to Art Basel many years before, but this time with a really different kind of eye and ear and sense to the interactions, the traffic, the conversations, the cacophony, the noise, everything that was happening, not just on the Miami Beach area, but specific to the beautiful Beaux-Arts facade to the beach. And what I learned was that there was an incredible diversity, demographically speaking. There are homeless people, there are people at the Basel Museum who are purely there to look at art. I had learned of a bit of back and forth between whether to put benches in front of the Basel Museum because it would encourage homeless people to sleep on them, so on and so forth. But then, of course, you get these great 4 or 5-star hotels flanking Collins Park, the very expensive restaurants and shops. And then on the beach, beachgoers, people coming from all over the world to enjoy South Beach. And I really wanted to take that in and think about the fair and what the fair means when it comes for this 5-day period every early December to Miami Beach, bringing, I think the estimate is 50,000 people with it. And to create a selection of works that not necessarily reflected it or underscored it, but responded to it, that interacted with it, that both suited the immediate interests of what the fair was about showing objects, and in the case of the fair, commercial objects for sale, but this sort of idea around public sculpture. But in addition to that, it was very important for me to bring a variety of practices to Art Public that represented, in my purview as a curator of contemporary art, that reflected artistic practices and cultural production, not just in the United States, but internationally. So to really have the kind of range and diversity of projects, types of projects, to also be very diverse with my selection of artists, and to create an international and intergenerational selection of artists and work. To this end, I selected 24 works, and hopefully that speak to those endeavors and interests. Today, I have with me, I've asked Theaster Gates and Kaino to be on this panel with me. I'll be moderating, to talk a bit about their practices and about the work that they're presenting for Art Public. So I'm going to start by giving you a brief bio, and then Theaster will speak, Glenn will speak. If the opportunity is available to have a discussion amongst us, or you want to open up to the audience, I just kind of want to leave it up to how the flow might go. Theaster Gates is a Chicago-based artist who was born in 1973 and whose not only work but education is extremely inter and transdisciplinary. He received a BS in urban planning from Iowa State in '96, in '98 an MA in religious studies from the University of Cape Town, and in 2006 an MS in urban planning, ceramics, and religious studies at Iowa State. I haven't read it, but I found the title of his thesis very interesting. It's Space, Memory, and the Constant Pursuit of God. I Built This House. He's also the director of the arts program in development at the University of Chicago, has had solo exhibitions, the Milwaukee Art Museum, MCA Chicago, currently at LA MoCA, and has had lectures, done lectures, group shows, performances internationally. He'll also have a very large project featured at this upcoming Documenta. He, in addition to teaching, and being an artist, he's also a musician. And the music really comes into the work. It did for Art Public, and I hope that Theaster will speak a bit more about that. His work can be described as transforming spaces, institutions, traditions, and perceptions. And I recently, before Basel, I saw a performance that Theaster Gates did with the Black Monks of Mississippi, with whom he performed on Wednesday night at LA MoCA a couple of weeks ago. And what really struck me was, and it doesn't happen often, but when there's a very certain kind of balance between the sort of intellectual and conceptual capacity, underpinnings, and strength of a work, but that's also fused with something that's incredibly moving and beautiful. I think it's something that's difficult that a lot of artists endeavor to achieve, and Theaster certainly does. Glenn Kaino was born in 1973 also.
Oh,
Sign, Sagittarius. You're Cancer, you're Cancer. He received his MFA from UCSD in '96, his BFA from UCI in '93. He's LA-based through and through. He's had solo exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art Altria, LAX Art, the Andy Warhol Museum, Art Pace Houston, and been in a number of group shows at the Hammer Museum, the Asia Society, and I was fortunate enough to work with Glenn in 2003. He did a collaboration with Mark Bradford, which I featured in an exhibition I did at the Studio Museum in Harlem called Black Belt. His conceptual practice has taken his work into the worlds of magic, illusion, gaming, cultural and identity politics. And the one sort of thread for me that runs throughout these various bodies and types of work, really in all media, is this kind of underscoring and manipulation of different belief systems and how that comes into play in both culture and society as well as in contemporary art. Theaster.
All right. So, how y'all doing today? I'm a little bit hungover, so just bear
We'll be
with
gentle.
us. Yeah. Can we start this video? I'm going to show a video for about 2 or 3 minutes. And I think that'll, if you guys can put your conceptual hats on, and we'll just let the video spin. I won't say a whole lot about it. Thank you. The sing.
Can turn this down. The lights. The lights down.
You can pause it there. If you can just, thank you. So this is Yao, a black vocalist from Chicago, jazz soul singer, and a sister named Aya, who was born a black Buddhist practicing Buddhism at a largely Japanese sect temple in Chicago. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with an ensemble that I created called the Black Monks of Mississippi. The Black Monks were really a response to a set of sculptural devices, a set of installation spaces that I had made. And once those spaces were made, I really felt like they were still kind of unfinished in the way that a church pew feels empty because there's not a group of people sitting there, or a choir stand feels empty, or a pulpit. It's like the architecture is there, but there's this part that's like, man, And there were all these spaces that I would occupy as a young person where at this particular moment in ceremony, the space really required people to make the whole thing work, and that the space without the people was just kind of a dead thing. And I think that I'm really interested in how objects without loadedness, and sometimes without the hand of people, how those objects are possibly potent, possibly powerful, spaces possibly powerful, but sometimes spaces being made more powerful and objects being made more powerful as a result of people touching them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you would go to the next slide, please. You can just push the slide forward, the arrow forward. Thank you. As Christine mentioned, I'm trained as a potter. I'm really proud of that. The other part of my training is urban planning. I don't have an MFA or a BFA, and I talk about that a lot because I feel like the hand skills that I have really came from my dad. My dad was a roofer and a builder and a kind of entrepreneur, like ghetto style. He owned buildings and he took care of those buildings and he got rent. And that rent, when people paid the rent, bought us food. And there was a direct correlation between my dad's hands and our ability to eat. Our survival was kind of dependent. The 9 of us, my 8 sisters and I, our survival was dependent upon this person's ability to generate money every 2 weeks. And I became really kind of conditioned to understanding money as something that was immediate and that's something that was like urgent and that could go away very quickly, right? But there was something about the way that my dad loved work that made being a potter really natural. I found myself really curious about the history of American pottery, and then how craft, which in some ways could seem so neutral, could still have the capacity to leave people out of traditions. So I found myself, as I became more proficient with my hands, really asking, how are my hands connected to the cultural loadedness of American ceramics, and is it? Next slide, please. In so many ways, I really struggled both to be an artist that was kind of really conscious of the burden of representation and history, and also an artist really interested and invested in ideas. I was really frustrated that it wasn't enough for me to be a potter and have really important ideas, that I found myself in the middle of these debates about this or that. Was unwilling to create a body of work or be the kind of artist that was just concentrating a lot on the history of representation, the history of blackness in work, but I was also determined not to just be a potter or just be a conceptual artist that kind of had to let go of my history with clay? How could I move all those things that I believe in forward? Often I found that the objects that I made were connected to places that were really important to me, places that were either historical places from my past or places that had such loaded politics that those politics need to be unearthed, resurfaced, made readily available for other people to kind of ask questions about, like, why is it that a mayor would destroy a quarter of his city because a crack addict used the building to stay warm in and smoke some crack? Like, why is that the reason for destroying a building, for razing whole parts of the South Side, or whole parts of Detroit, or whole parts of Pittsburgh? Like, why not try to intervene in the real problem? I was really curious about the relationship between Black people, abandonment, history, between buildings and mayoral city policies that governed which buildings became historic landmarks and why some other buildings got torn down. You can go to the next one. And so I found myself really falling in love with these buildings and falling in love with them in a way that allows me to kind of act as a steward of a certain set of buildings and take those materials and then kind of represent them in front of people. And as a way of kind of representing them, asking questions about what qualifies beauty, what qualifies the conceptual or the political, and then how is it that we could use this economy, these kind of weird moments of cultural engagement where things conflate, where age and wealth, good looks, class, sex, but all those things become like one thing for 96 hours. Can I use a moment like this art fair to make enough money to restore a block? And if I could, is that an interesting and reasonable ecology of circumstance? Or am I just like an art pimp, an art hoe? Right? And so these objects, in addition to trying to be poetic, they're also trying to locate a set of problems in a city, a set of problems in the history of dysfunctional cities, and policies that favored the creation of new suburbs for white men returning home from war, policies that allowed banks to support the creation of these new suburbs and then forget about these Black inner city cores. I wanted to have conversations about race and space without really having to have conversations about race and space. That when you talk about the history of cities, it's impossible to get around these migratory patterns, these issues of haves and have-nots. That in some ways, my art practice has been the best way to practice urban planning. And I'll stop there.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glenn Kaino.
Hi.
Glenn, it'll take a second for them to switch computers.
Yeah, well, I'll just start anyway, and we can catch up. You know, I think that I share a lot of the concerns and questions that you raise in your practice. With the inception of my practice, one of the things that concerned me most was I came of age in a time where there was a real Boolean dialectic between art and politics, meaning, value, formal exchange, and as a student and then as a young practitioner, I rejected the notion that I had to be in a camp or I had to have my work only function as you were describing in one certain way. And for the early stages, you know, of my career, like I was in search of models to try to figure out how to be generative in a postmodern economy where images and ideas were charted and whatnot. And the first real model that I came up and used often in the creation of some of these site-specific works that you're about to see is a concept called kit bashing. And kit bashing is an old model maker's term when it means taking the parts of a model kit and not making what the instructions say. Literally bashing the kit. And I don't know about you, but I never had the patience to like make a model. And one time when I was in the studio, I was training with some model makers, and there was this really fast setting glue, and I was like, oh my God, this changes the whole world for me. And I began to like destroy model kits or use the kits that I already had and make drawings with them and reassemble them in new ways. And I sort of have this series of drawings that you know, began to articulate and express some of these concepts. There's like a view tab, and then it says slideshow at the bottom. So my practice was a multi-threaded one, where I would search for new models of production and knowledge generation, while I would also engage in very site-specific works. So the second work, can we go to the next one? Second work, for example, is a 16 feet long hammer made for the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego, out of 4,000 dolls that I worked with Zapatista tribes in southern Mexico over the course of a summer. They produced them, and I wrapped them up into an icon of sorts for a faceless revolution. And so there's, you know, I began to kit bash with concepts, with objects, with forms as a way of rejecting a singular methodology. Next slide, please. I'll just show some work because I know we're running short on time. So next slide. This is a performance at the Whitney Altria where I built chess sets out of candles, and we played with them lit. And it was called The Burning Boards. And I had chess masters play with artists, and trying to transform something like a game of chess, which is a dance that happens intellectually in people's heads, which is essentially about the future and like how many moves ahead can you think. But because the candles melt at different speeds, it throws you back into the past because you have to remember what pieces are which, and you have to collaborate with your opponent, who becomes your collaborator in the process. Next slide. So this is a grafted taxidermies. Next slide. This is a Herman Miller Aeron chair that spins up at 225 RPM, so it becomes a chalice, and it's called the Siege Perilous. Next slide. And this is a monument commissioned by the Heinz Endowment for the city of Pittsburgh's 250th anniversary. It's a 20-foot transformer made out of the bridges of the city. But what I found for the first few years when making these objects is that while I enjoyed the engineering potential of putting together disparate parts of concepts and objects, it still left me very flat because it was very hyper-rationalized in a way, and everything was very resolved or resolvable, and I found myself attempting to resolve things. And particularly for the project for Art Public, I was here at Art Basel, Miami in 2008, and it was a particularly stressful fair because the economy was under a severe amount of stress, as it is now, but in a different way because it was the first big crash. And you know, some fairs are defined. People say, hey, you talk to a gallerist and say, hey, are you having a good fair? Are you having a bad fair? I think universally in 2008, everyone was having a very stressful fair. And I saw people around me who, not just artists, collectors, curators, writers, who were devastated and are under a tremendous amount of stress. And I said, you know, I never got into making artwork for money or for the economic circumstance, though I know that it is a vital part of the existence of the ecology. And so I got on a plane back to LA, where I'm from, and I said, you know what, I have to figure out a new system of belief that is not one that exists in the hyper-rationalized, not one that exists in the scientific. And so I decided to suspend my studio practice for 18 months, and I went to LA and I studied only with magicians for 18 months. And I learned a lot of things. And while I also learned a lot of magic tricks, let's say, one of the first things that turned me, you know, where I knew I felt something was interesting happening is the first magician that I worked with said to me, he said, if you do not believe that the magical effect that you're trying to present to the audience is real, even though you know that you are manipulating it and doing it, and there is a technique. If you do not believe that it is real, clearly no one in the audience is going to believe that it's real, because no one is going to believe in your magic more than you. And I thought, what a beautiful, exciting, invigorating metaphor for me as an artist, because if I didn't believe that my work as a post-colonial narrative, my work as a conceptual narrative was valuable at all or meaningful at all, then clearly no one else, I couldn't expect anyone else to believe the same. And I then thought, wow, for the entire system that we participate in, myself as an artist, you guys as audience, curators, writers, or whatever, artists, we all must be complicit. And it's, for me, like that suspension of disbelief, willing suspension of disbelief and belief at the same time was something, and that simultaneity was something that I thought was really meaningful to me. And so I then rebooted my practice based on, next slide, based on that type of thinking, where I had a conceptual component, an engineered component, but also a more faith-based belief component, where it was, so there wasn't unknown, there were unlocked secrets that were generative. One of the first exercises I did was I worked with a legendary magic wand maker who was one of the most famous magicians in the world, and he only makes wands that that he bestows upon people, or the people who win major magic awards. And I asked him if I could collaborate with him to make wands for my favorite conceptual artists, and so we worked on a body of work, conceptual art wands. Next slide. So, John Bell, sorry. Next slide. Well, this is a video, but we'll skip it. Next slide. This is a portrait of Ricky Jay made out of playing cards thrown into a wall. Next slide. Which brings us to Art Public. When Christine asked me about conceptualizing a project for Art Public, it was very meaningful because of this journey that I was on. This magical journey started here. And so I created a project called Levitating the Fair, where I was going to build a 15-foot by 15-foot minimalist replica of the 1939 World Fair with the Trialon and the Perisphere, which was the fair that was a transition point because it was conceptualized in 1935 as a reaction to the Great Depression, as a moment of hope. And I thought, what would a great thing for me to sort of contribute to this discourse. And so I did that, and I thought, well, I will call it a levitation, but what I will do is I will ask hundreds of people over the course of the day to help me levitate it. And so with the dialogue being, I'm calling it a levitation, but clearly, next slide please. Clearly you can see the people holding it up. And so therefore understanding that there is a technique and a method, but I asked people to see past that and think about all the metaphoric possibility of levitating, invoking origins of the fair and sort of what all these things mean. And we started at 4 p.m. and we set it down ceremonially at 10:47 p.m. Had over 500 and 600 people come in over the course of the day, and come in for 5 minutes, for 1 minute, for some for the whole time, for 6 hours, came in and helped me lift this and hold it up, suspended in the air. Next slide. And they just rotated it back and forth, and we actually did a time lapse, so it's great because you can see it sort of slip and move. And next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So it was a conversation piece. People sort of had conversations, and it really came together, sort of with the dialogue about their labor. They were really paying for their work and labor. There was not an economic transaction that happened with the work, and so that's what we did. And we were so pleased when Theaster came by. Actually, I will tell the story because I think it's very interesting in terms of how the work operates together, or had in this moment operated together. We were lifting since 4 p.m. because purposely, when the opening happened, I was not wanting the ceremonial lifting to be an event. I wanted it to be a running concern, so it didn't feel like the lifting was the actual art, but that the sustaining was the art. And Theaster's crew came by in the early afternoon, and it was a rehearsal or some early singing, and the people that were there holding it up were so moved that when he walked away, we had to get a radio because it was like this, spatially, the energy and the music and the doubling up of the action created this conceptual space that when you left was vacated, and it was amazing how that happened. And we literally sat there and waited 2.5 hours holding up. It's like, wait, the Theaster's going to come. They're coming back. They're coming back. And so just as the to talk about sort of activation of space and how like layering of meaning and sort of engagement happens. That to me was a very transformative one because it was really poetic and beautiful the way those two came. So thank you very much as well. So
Pleasure.
that's what I got.
Good. Thank you. One of the things that I hear both of you talked about, we met last night to sort of talk about the panel, and we ended up just talking about kind of everything else and different ideas that come into your work and that come into our lives. And belief systems, which I brought up before in relation to Glenn's practice, is something that what I'm finding and listening to you today is there's belief system, and then there's this sort of there's the anticipation, and that one, that they work together in this certain kind of tension and harmony. In Glenn's case, this idea directly, from the fair, levitating the fair, this idea that we sort of collectively, collectors, curators, writers, etc., collectively hold up this belief system that art is somehow good, art is somehow something that helps our lives or pays the bills or gives us hope or whatever it might do for an individual, but this kind of set of beliefs. And I think in Theaster's case, that there's this kind of set of a belief system that kind of you have set up, but in a more sort of abstract way, working with the Black monks of Mississippi, in your own practice, this sort of belief system in the church, in God, and the questions around that, and certainly in gospel and choir. And I'm wondering if those belief systems, they're very plural because they're also very layered and of different scales and shapes working simultaneously, how that came together on Wednesday evening, specifically Theaster starting singing with the Black monks and performing here at the fair, where you kind of activated this space, but then brought into the lyrics, I think you mentioned Kavi Gupta and Gagosian Gallery and Lehman Maupin, and there are things that happen in the sort of improvised context, but specific to the fair, and then in Glenn's case, of course, the actual sort of part of the inspiration for the piece itself.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been talking about quite a bit is that let's assume that the art world in some ways is a fairly new world for me. It's not one that I grew up with. My parents weren't collectors and my grandparents. And so in some ways I'm kind of meeting the art world with fresh eyes. But they're fresh eyes that have a history of kind of understanding at an emotive and a bodily level systems of belief, and then a learned kind of theoretical, conceptual idea of what belief systems are. And when I realized, when I entered this ground of the art world, I realized like, oh, this is like church. This like, people get together every year for their convocations, and they tithe. They give patronage to these artists, and they find emerging artists who no one knows, and they spend all this money on them with this idea that in the future there's some real value that they'll gain, either monetary value for those who like pork bellies, or another kind of value, like the value of being able to identify someone who's really good, really young, and deserves an opportunity to share their great ideas with the world. That belief seemed parallel to this other belief system that I grew up in. And that maybe it would be more interesting if I never left this other belief system that I grew up in, and every once in a while would just kind of touch base with the art world and be like, oh, wow. And in this moment for me, where things are really crazy, and like my presence in the art world is still a bit of a kind of unexpected set of awesome circumstances, and maybe partly because there are all these people that are hustling to make this thing work, and also because I hustle really hard, but maybe there's something that has nothing to do with our hustle that's like creating this new moment of opportunity. Like, what do you do with that? And is there a way in the middle of this kind a torrid whirlwind that could come and go, may come for a longer time? Is there a way that I could ask questions about what this moment means? And when I'm trying to like keep my feet about me, what are the things that are like helpful in managing that weight? And even though I don't go to church anymore and I'm not kind of quite sure about where the center of whatever is, it felt really good to walk through what some people would call just a system of capitalist production with this other anchor that's like super sexy. And that maybe there's something really special that could happen when those two systems of belief rub up against each other. And I could just be crazy, but I don't think I'm crazy.
I don't think so.
I think it's interesting because that slippage is what I think is super interesting, and it's really amazing and interesting and fun for me to think about. You know, one of the first major challenges to conceptual art in the early '70s was about belief, and it was about conceptual art growing on the back of belief that a non sort of a representative sort of means of artistic production was actually art. And you know, from there, because of technology and systems and mapping and whatnot, the world has become hyper-rationalized. This system that we are all complicit within is hyper-rationalized. Like, there are steps and hyper-professionalized. There are steps where you go to an MFA or not, you know, or you go, you know, you go get shows, and you go. There are systems in place for critical validation and whatnot that allow certain circumstances to happen. And I think that what I think has effectively done is closed the gap for imagination. And you know, art to me fundamentally is about being imaginative and thinking about new worlds and creating new worlds. You know, via the work. You know, and so it's no surprise to me that in a world where, because of iPhones and sort of advanced technology and mapping and Google Earth, that there's not a lot of unknown out there. And so you can walk down the floor and figure out how everything in this floor is made on Google, you know, but it doesn't matter, you know. And so it's really amazing to me that your work and what I'm trying to do, or to think about, you know, sort of conceptual circumstances, like really, you know, really like faith, you know, faith-based, non-believing without knowing why you should believe.
Yeah, and there, you know, it's fun too to kind of get to know Glenn's work in a way, because there was this moment where people also become really important, but not in the way of a kind of history of relational aesthetics or some kind of theorized notion of like, oh, I should now start hugging people, or I should. It's like, no, that there's a way in which people are important to a project either because you really need help, or as a result of you having people around, they get to have this kind of shared experience, or by bringing them together, there's some other commentary that folk are working, that there's a way in which they're working, and maybe the work is also rooted in belief. And then there are moments where an object pops out, or a set of objects pop out, or there's a way in which we get to operate both at a relational level with a group of people, and then kind of have it make sense inside of a space like this, have it make sense on a stage. And I think that that's the part that I'm getting really excited about, that there's a way in which the art world is actually allowing me to be a whole person, whether it intended to do that or its history would suggest to me that I have the right to do it. I'm trying to bring to consequence the idea that I'm not interested in just having a modernist moment, but in fact, one that's much more complicated.
Yeah. I'm getting the 5-minute, but
Holy
now it's
cow.
probably 3-minute signal from Claudio. And I wanted to give you all the opportunity if you had any questions or thoughts to share. Yes.
My name is Marisela Lagraf, New York-based media artist. I find this conversation fascinating, and one of the two things that I just want to bring up is, first of all, the place that you guys are at in your careers right now, which I find really interesting in what you were just discussing on the art world vis-a-vis your background and whatever it's been, your whole process of existence and becoming an artist. But what I really want to ask or comment on is the function of artists in the 21st century vis-a-vis the Hollywood stardom structure that's been inevitable, including Obama, it's had to succumb to it. Probably the most profound aspect of art practice that's connected to the tribe or to the more primitive society where artists were part of, there was no one artist, which everybody was an artist. Everybody was working for the well-being of the whole community. You know, look at the world we're living in, it's collapsing. I'm just wondering, the question here is, you're questioning about, I mean, I don't believe there is a belief system or anything. I mean, whoever believes in anything, it's hitting themselves in a wall. There's nothing to believe in. But what your actions as an artist, both of you, your actions as an artist are obviously coming from, I mean, the aspect of taking over space or the magic of space or that whole thing that happens when you, I am asking the question.
Yeah.
In a hurry?
Sorry.
Okay, that's
just
it.
The question of.
Well, I don't know what the question is. I'm just bringing in the fact that, you know, you're in this turning point on your career and where you're asking yourself, you know, you're about to be taken by the art world, and then there is this other, you know, aspect of your intention as an artist within the communal structure.
You know, I'll respond to that first, actually, because the way that the fair is structured, really, right? The galleries apply because they want to have a booth. The fair, the committees that exist, accept them or don't accept them for whatever reason. I mean, there's a system in place. But sort of, for me, being asked to curate Art Public was very much, in my estimation for myself, as well as theirs of me, was sort of about to bring in this kind of type of dynamic practice that's part performance, that's part object, that you know, sort of speaks to, in terms of content and context, the fair itself, but also works within what you know, sort of parameters we do have. So I think, you know, where they are in their careers, I think part of that is something that was important for me to bring in, that it's not just Damien Hirst, Anthony Gormley, you know, George Rickey, so on and so forth. But there are performative and gesture things that happen that do go away, but that fill out that larger picture about sort of cultural thought and production.
Yeah, I'll be short. This is, to me, this is not the art world. This is the art market, and the role of the artist is to be generative and to generate new worlds. And that's that sort of. My work pervades different media and different, you know, circumstances, and you know, this is a market economy here, which is a necessary part of it in terms of a structural engagement for a certain type of art practice. But I agree with you that right now, this world needs art. I liken art to like, or the art world as in a way is a means for people to strive towards being imaginative. And if that helps, great. There are many other ways to do that. There are many other creative practices that don't include or have the ambition to be here. But I think that if this does contribute to helping that in some way for that segment of people who need to or would like to unlock an imagination, for me it's about imagining new worlds.
Good.
I would like to respond to that.
Please.
And then finally, I mean, I think the point you're asking or making is actually a really good one, that in a way, part of, when I think about religious systems, I could also say that they're religious markets, and that they're as economically viable as this art fair. And that depending on how you were to gauge any system, you could kind of tease out systems of exploitation, systems of like extreme capitalism, systems of extreme generosity. And so I've been asking the question, what is it that I bring to a system as an artist? And then more specifically to your point of the role of artists in the 21st century, I think that there's this moment where people can have much more courage than they've ever had to do bigger things than they've ever imagined because of the kind of weirdness of this moment. And like, how do you exploit that?
Great.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you, Claudio, Leah, Fluck, and the team at Art Basel.